Chapter 4, The Breaking. Freedom does not arrive with trumpets. It slips in as a question that refuses to leave. The binding had marked her body, a scar across her palm where her blood had mingled with his. Yet the deeper wound was in her spirit. She could still feel the blade slicing, the warmth of blood, the weight of voices chanting that she was no longer her own. For the others, perhaps it was covenant. Inside the binding house, she discovered quickly that silence could be a weapon of her own, though. When the matrons instructed her to repeat the vows, she kept her lips pressed shut until one pinched her arm hard enough to leave a bruise. When he told her to kneel, she stood until her legs shook with the effort of not kneeling in front of him. These small acts, invisible to those who believed obedience was inevitable, became her rebellion. Each refusal whispered, "I am still mine." Days blurred into nights, nights blurred into days, and so on and so on. She kept on and on, defying who they wanted her to be. She marked them not by the sun, which rarely pierced the gray sky, but by the beat of her heart as she pressed her scarred palm against the wall. Each night she whispered the same vow, her voice a thread of sound swallowed by the smoke-filled air. I will not break. Others had broken. She saw them in their eyes of girls who once sang beside her, now hollowed in silence. Punishments followed her defiance. A missed prayer meant a day without food. A refusal to bow meant hours on her knees kept her on the cold stone. Her body weakened, but her mind sharpened. Pain became teacher rather than the master, and she learned that suffering could be endured when it carried the seed of freedom. What they called discipline, she called proof that she had not yielded. He too became part of her study. At first, he was only a shadow, hooded, silent, a figure carved from stone. But over nights of forced companionship, she began to see a little cracking, a slight bending. She could break him. His gaze sometimes lingered too long, not with desire, but with hesitation. The climax of her resistance arrived one night when an elder demanded she speak her vow aloud in front of the chapel before the gathered matron villagers and him. She was ordered to repeat the words that I am his, I am the lion, I am the vessel. The words scorched her throat, but she swallowed them. Lips closed, the elder struck her across the face. Not just once, twice, so many times until she bled, until blood filled her mouth. Still, she refused. From that night forward, she knew her path had changed. She was no longer only surviving, she was resisting. Her rebellion was not yet an escape, but it was a fracture in the wall, a crack that would one day widen. She pressed her palm against the wall once more and vowed, I will not break. The walls of the binding house were not merely stone, they were an architect of control. Each block carried the whispers of those who had bent, broken, or vanished into obedience. She could almost hear them at night, murmuring in her dreams, voices like chains rattling just beyond her reach. It was said that the house had stood for generations, binding people together, unwilling, but a must. But to her it felt like it not just been for generations, but an eternity, as if it had been born without world itself. Each day began the same. The matron struck the bells and forged from black iron, their sound carrying like the toll of inevitability. Girls were herded into lines like cattle, each step measured like sheep, each breath accounted for like mules. They were drilled in words that tasted like ashes, submission, vessel, purity. Punishments, too, became rituals. When food was withheld, they closed her eyes and feasted only on her memories. Bread baked by her mother's hand, she remembers, sweetened by honey stolen from the jars in her childhood. How could she forget the joys of her former home? When forced onto her knees, she transformed the stone beneath her into imagined fields, her knees pressing therefore into grass rather than the granite. Pain had become a way of teaching her that imagination could be an armor. And then there stood him. He remained the most dangerous puzzle. His hood concealed his expression, his every expression. But she had learned to watch the subtleties, the twitch of a jaw, the hesitation in the step, the moments when he lingered too long as if words fought for escape. She wondered if he was a mirror bound by chains of doctrine as surely as she was bound by stone. One day, her public defiance right by the chapel was thick like the smoke and the incense that was coming out of the chapel. The elders gathered in robes that swept the floor like shadows, their voices rising in rehearsed authority. She stood in the center, every eye open upon her, the weight of expectation pressing like iron across her shoulders. When commanded to speak the vow, her silence became a weapon sharper than any blade. Dragged back into the house, her body ached with every step, yet inside her a fire had been lit. She lay upon the hard floor in the night that felt the warmth of her own resolve. She pressed her scarred palm against the stone wall and whispered once more, "I will not break." The words vibrated through her, low and certain, until she believed they might seep into the very foundations of the binding house itself. The days that followed grew heavier. Matrons watched her more closely. Punishments grew harder and harsher, and whispers spread amongst the girls, louder and louder. Some looked at her with fear as if her rebellion endangered them all. Others with awe as if she had carved a possibility they had not dared to dream. She had become a savior. She began to seek the cracks in the system, an elder who flattered her speech, repeating lines as though uncertain, a matron who lingered too long when punishing her, eyes betraying hesitation. Even he, when forced into proximity, sometimes allowed silence to stretch between them instead of filling it with doctrine. Each hesitation was a fracture, and a fracture grew when pressure mounted, and she accounted for it. But still her resistance carried the cost. Nights stretched longer, her stomach howled with hunger more, and her body trembled even colder upon the stone. She dreamed of freedom, yet awoke to chains or routine. At times doubt clawed at her. Her vow deepened, transforming from a whispered defiance to a quiet strategy. She began to observe not only people but patterns. When the bells rang, which matrons grew weary at dusk, she knew escape would not only come as the inevitability, but unfortunately not so easily. Perhaps not even soon, but for the first time she believed it was possible, and belief, she realized, was its own rebellion. The binding house became a crucible in which she reshaped, not in the vessel they demanded, but onto a weapon, one they could not anticipate. Every ritual forced upon her became a test of endurance, and every test became a rehearsal for freedom. She memorized the rhythm of the bells, the cadence of the elders' chants, and the light that was shifting through the narrow slits of the windows, through the gray of the skies. She noted which matron's hand trembled when lifting the rod upon her to discipline, which elders' voices cracked upon the strain of speech when trying to discipline. The other girls, too, became part of her map, eyes observing her, eyes to witness. Though they spoke little, fear sealing their lips tighter than their command, she leaned in and she learned to read them all. A glance could be a paragraph, a shiver, an entire conversation, or confession. She saw who had resigned themselves, eyes glazed with surrender, and who had carried themselves with embers that crackled in the fire of their hearts. She read the room not as a prisoner, but as a choreographer, one who could architect the unleashing of these chains. Every tremor of hesitation, every flicker of doubt, a matron's gaze, even a whisper of rebellion in another girl's eyes. These were the lines of her map. These were her encouragement. A map not of walls, but of weakness. An encouragement of emboldenment, an embodiment to never break. That night, as the bells tolled and silence swept the house, she lay awake on the cold floor, hunger gnawing at her as always, bruises throbbing, pain continuous. But the fire within her burned steadier than ever. She pressed her palm against the scared stone and whispered again, "I will not break." The words no longer felt like rebellion. They felt like prophecy. And though her body remained trapped within the binding house, her spirit had already begun to escape.